Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Derry, New Hampshire, May 1st, 1990. A young husband, just 24 years old, is found dead inside his own condominium. Within minutes of a 911 call, officers enter the residence and confirm what neighbors could not believe. Greg Smart, shot once in the head, no signs of forced entry, no theft, no struggle, a crime too clean to look random. The timeline of Greg's final evening was tight. He left work in Merrimack late in the day, drove back to the condo, and was home by early evening. Neighbors saw his car parked where it always was. Hours passed without phone calls, without visitors, without noise. At 10:10 p.m., the 911 call brought police to the scene. When they arrived, Greg was already gone. The scene presented anomalies investigators know well. The body in the living room, angled near the couch, his wallet, jewelry, and keys untouched. No drawers pulled, no glass broken, no door splintered. Chairs aligned as if nothing had moved. The stillness itself raised suspicion. Evidence collection began immediately: photographs, string measurements, vacuum samples from the carpet. But the findings were negative. No foreign prints, no footprints, no stolen property. If a casing had been left, it was gone. If a stranger had entered, there was no sign of it. Geographically, Greg's last movements were contained. From his office in Merrimack to the condominium in Derry. That was it. The gap between his arrival and the emergency call became the central question. What happened in those silent hours? The medical examiner confirmed death at the scene. A close-range gunshot wound to the head. No defensive marks, no substances in his system. Cause of death: execution-style killing in his own home. For investigators, the absence of struggle and theft eliminated burglary as motive. The crime looked personal, deliberate, and calculated. Yet in those first hours, they had no weapon, no suspect, and no explanation. Only a young man, well-liked, with no known enemies, suddenly dead inside a silent room. As one detective wrote in his notes, this was too controlled, too little noise, too little evidence. The investigation would now shift from the scene to the people in Greg's life, starting with his wife Pamela. The investigation into the killing of Greg Smart moved quickly from the chaos of discovery to the quieter, more methodical stage of background checks and interviews. When detectives closed off the condominium that night, they knew the next step was not only to preserve the scene, but also to build a picture of the victim's life and relationships. In homicide work, the absence of a break-in and the lack of a theft motive push investigators toward the people closest to the victim. Greg Smart was 24 years old, employed as an insurance salesman in the nearby town of Merrimack, New Hampshire. By most accounts, he was personable, responsible, and deeply involved with music, particularly hard rock. Friends described him as easygoing, the kind of young man who would talk at length about a favorite album or the future he hoped to build. He had been married for less than a year to Pamela Smart, a 22-year-old media services coordinator at Winnicott High School. To the outside world, they were a typical suburban couple, building a life together. Police records from those early interviews show that Greg's colleagues at the insurance office did not recall any conflicts, financial troubles, or unusual behavior in the days leading up to May 1st, 1990. He had left work at his normal time, driven home, and there was no indication that he expected danger. Detectives noted this in their logs. Greg's daily routine was consistent, predictable, and unremarkable. That normality clashed sharply with the precision of the crime scene they had just processed. Pamela Smart's interview took place within hours of Greg's death. The detectives recorded her emotional state as tearful but conversational. She described returning to the condominium to find police present and her husband already declared dead. In her statement, she explained that Greg had no enemies she could think of and that their life together was typical for newlyweds in southern New Hampshire. What caught the attention of investigators, however, was the way she moved quickly to discuss her own future and how she would manage without Greg, rather than focusing solely on the shock of his killing. It was not enough to treat her as a suspect at that point, but in homicide files across the country, investigators often highlight behavior that diverges from expected norms. In the margins of the report, one officer wrote, "Statements consistent with deflection. Subject appears more concerned with perception than loss." It was an observation, not proof, but these details become threads investigators pull when evidence is thin. The autopsy results delivered later that week reinforced what crime scene technicians had already suspected. Greg had been shot at close range in the head. No defensive wounds, no other injuries. There was no evidence that he had struggled, suggesting he either trusted the person in front of him or was taken by complete surprise. The medical examiner's time of death estimate aligned with the 911 call logged just after 10 p.m. Financial checks came next. Detectives subpoenaed Greg's banking and credit records, looking for sudden cash withdrawals, unexplained purchases, or signs of debt that could indicate a financial motive. Nothing stood out. His accounts showed regular payments on household expenses, insurance, and utilities. There were no signs of gambling or hidden spending. From an investigative standpoint, this was negative evidence again. The victim had no apparent financial vulnerabilities that could explain a targeted crime. As the days moved on, investigators turned to Greg and Pamela's social network. Friends of the couple told officers that while Greg was easygoing, Pamela was ambitious and vocal about her career plans. She wanted recognition, advancement, and was heavily invested in her job at the school. One colleague mentioned that Pamela often complained about Greg's lack of drive, contrasting his love of music with her focus on moving forward professionally. These statements were logged as preliminary background. They did not establish motive, but they began to draw a picture of tension behind the marriage. Detectives also canvassed the condominium complex again. They asked neighbors about any visitors that evening, any unusual cars or loud noises. Nobody reported hearing a gunshot. Nobody saw anyone suspicious enter or leave. This reinforced the controlled nature of the homicide. A killer who either had access or was let in without question. The absence of outside witnesses narrowed the investigative path further toward people already within Greg's circle. Pamela's statements in follow-up interviews included one detail investigators flagged. She insisted repeatedly that Greg must have been killed by someone random, possibly a burglar or intruder, but the lack of forced entry and the absence of theft directly contradicted that. Detectives noted in their logs that her insistence seemed rehearsed, as if trying to guide them back toward the idea of a random crime. It did not prove complicity, but it placed her words against the physical evidence. In homicide investigations, when spoken narrative and forensic reality diverge, detectives often dig deeper. At this stage, police did not yet have a suspect. The crime scene yielded no weapon, no prints, no clear lead. The only certainty was that Greg Smart was executed inside his own home with precision. When investigators find so little, they focus on background. They build timelines, interview social contacts, and compare every statement against the evidence. That process, while slow, is often where cracks appear. As one detective later put it, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Greg's life looked orderly. His finances were stable. His social interactions appeared calm. Yet he was dead, shot in a way that suggested planning. The question investigators began to ask was not only who wanted Greg gone, but who could have engineered a crime scene this quiet, this sterile, without leaving a trail. It is worth noting for viewers that when a murder appears this controlled, investigators often treat it as a signal of access. Random killers do not execute victims in silent rooms and leave without chaos. They make noise, they leave traces, they cause disruption. Greg's death lacked all of that, pointing back to familiarity and planning. The human side of this case was also surfacing in Derry. Friends of Greg expressed disbelief. They described him as kind, loyal, and not someone who sought conflict. One friend told police, Greg would have opened the door to anyone he knew. He wasn't the type to be suspicious. That comment, recorded in testimony, reinforced the growing suspicion that the killer had been someone known to him. As detectives closed out those early interviews, they began to compile patterns. Greg had no debt, no enemies, and no criminal ties. Pamela had expressed frustrations about the marriage, but not enough to stand alone as motive. And yet, investigators could not ignore the inconsistencies in her statements, the deflections in her interviews, and the precision of the homicide that pointed toward someone inside the victim's life rather than outside. The next would focus on forensics inside the home, the rooms, the vehicle, and the subtle signs investigators look for when answers do not appear on the surface. When investigators returned to the Smart condominium after the autopsy results, their focus shifted from collecting broad impressions to examining the fine details of the crime scene. The challenge in Greg Smart's case was not what was found, but what was absent. Detectives understood that absence can be as telling as presence. The absence of forced entry, the absence of stolen property, and the absence of defensive wounds all signaled control. It was now about breaking down that control into forensic layers that could withstand scrutiny. The timeline built from records and witness accounts anchored the inquiry. Greg left his insurance office in Merrimack late that afternoon. His car was logged in the condominium parking area by neighbors who recognized it. From there, the timeline went quiet. No outgoing calls from his landline, no visits logged. By 10 o'clock, the 911 call had alerted authorities to his body. This gap, hours of silence in the middle of an otherwise predictable evening, was critical. Investigators often say that a victim's last routine action becomes the baseline against which everything suspicious is measured. The scene itself was diagrammed in precise detail by crime scene technicians. Greg's body had been located in the living room, angled near the couch with no signs of disturbance around him. Furniture remained aligned. Kitchen counters were untouched. Forensic examiners used string measurements and photographs to confirm that no struggle had altered the layout. These quiet anomalies were noted in official reports. Too little disruption for a violent homicide. Physical evidence was minimal. There were no shell casings recovered, suggesting either a revolver had been used or that any casings had been removed with deliberate intent. No fingerprints were recovered that did not belong to the couple or expected residents. Carpets were vacuumed for trace evidence. Fibers and hairs were collected and sealed. Preliminary analysis found nothing foreign. In the language of forensic work, this was negative evidence, nothing new, nothing out of place, and nothing pointing outward. Investigators turned to digital traces. In 1990, this meant landline telephone records and any use of credit or bank accounts. Greg's phone showed no outgoing calls after his return home. There were no interruptions on the line. His bank accounts were stable, with no withdrawals or transfers. That silence across both physical and digital channels reinforced the belief that the killer had entered and exited without disruption. The house had not been breached from the outside. Someone had been inside, without leaving a mark. Geographically, the chain of Greg's final hours remained narrow. From his office in Merrimack, back to the condominium in Derry, then silence. Investigators canvassed local roads and businesses, asking if anyone had seen Greg elsewhere, but nothing supported an alternate path. The crime had occurred in the same place he lived, which underscored the likelihood of trust and access. The autopsy results aligned with the scene. A single close-range gunshot to the head, fired at an angle suggesting Greg was seated or relaxed when struck. No bruises, no defensive injuries, and no secondary wounds. Toxicology confirmed no substances in his system. The conclusion was clinical. Greg had been executed in his own living room. Cause of death was clear. Time of death narrowed to between his arrival home and the 911 call, with no intervening activity detected. In the absence of direct evidence, investigators reviewed Pamela Smart's early statements against the forensic record. She had suggested the possibility of a burglary or intruder, but the lack of forced entry directly contradicted that. There was no indication of missing valuables, no disrupted drawers, and no motive for theft. This contradiction became a focal point. When spoken narrative diverges from the physical scene, detectives dig deeper. It did not mean complicity, but it placed her words under closer examination. What stood out to detectives was how the crime scene aligned too neatly with the idea of an inside job. No noise, no mess, no chaos. One investigator later reflected, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Homicides in residential areas almost always leave behind stray evidence. A footprint, a casing, a neighbor who hears something. In this case, the silence was louder than noise. The community of Derry, still unsettled by the shock of Greg's killing, began to speculate. Some believed it was a targeted professional job. Others whispered about personal disputes. For investigators, speculation mattered less than procedure. They leaned into the absence, documenting every negative finding as carefully as a positive one. Every no forced entry, no theft, no phone activity, narrowed the possibilities. By the end of this stage of the investigation, detectives faced a paradox. They had a body, a precise cause of death, and a silent home. Yet they had no weapon, no suspect, and no clear trail to follow. In homicide work, That combination pushes the inquiry inward, into the victim's closest relationships, personal habits, and private connections. As this forensic review closed, the path ahead was clear. If the crime scene itself would not yield direct evidence, then investigators would need to examine the people surrounding Greg Smart. Background checks, interviews, and deeper dives into social networks would become the next phase. Crimes that look staged often are. The task now was to identify who had the motive, the access, and the control to execute such a clean act inside a suburban condominium. When the forensic silence inside the Smart condominium left investigators without a clear suspect, the case shifted toward people in Greg Smart's immediate circle. That meant building a victimology, understanding his marriage, his friendships, and the subtle tensions of his life. This process is procedural in every major homicide inquiry, because when the scene offers no outward suspects, investigators turn inward. The first layer was Greg's marriage. Interviews established that Greg and Pamela had been married less than a year. On paper, they looked like a stable young couple. He worked at an insurance office. She coordinated media services at a high school. Friends, however, painted a more complicated picture. Greg's passion for music and his relaxed approach to life often clashed with Pamela's ambition and drive. She was outspoken about wanting recognition in her career, sometimes frustrated with Greg's more measured pace. Detectives logged these accounts carefully. They were not motive, but they were context. Pamela's demeanor during interviews continued to attract attention. Detectives noted how she emphasized the idea of a random burglary, even though the forensic record clearly contradicted that. In homicide work, when words and physical evidence diverge, investigators watch closely. Still, at this stage, they did not have grounds for charges. The task was to keep collecting. At Winnicott High School, where Pamela worked, colleagues began offering their own observations. Several teachers described her as charismatic but also unusually close to certain students. One in particular, a 16-year-old named William Billy Flynn, was mentioned more than once. What stood out was not only his frequent presence near Pamela's office, but the level of personal attention she appeared to give him. Detectives recorded these comments as preliminary, not yet evidence, but enough to widen the scope. The focus on the high school environment introduced a new investigative angle. Students were interviewed in small groups, then separately. Some mentioned hearing rumors that Pamela spoke about her marriage in negative terms, sometimes suggesting she was unhappy or trapped. Others recalled seeing her with Flynn outside school grounds, which raised questions about boundaries. Each interview was logged, timed, and compared. Inconsistent stories became signals for follow-up. Meanwhile, investigators pursued digital traces available in 1990. Landline call records. Subpoenas for both Greg's and Pamela's home phone lines revealed a cluster of calls to numbers linked to students in Hampton. While not unusual for someone working in media services, detectives considered the timing. Calls late at night or during hours when Pamela was expected to be home with her husband. These records were flagged as working evidence, not conclusive but worth mapping against movements and witness statements. The geography chain remained tight. Greg's world stretched from Merrimack to Derry, predictable and consistent. Pamela's extended outward, including her daily travel to Hampton for work. That expansion became relevant because the potential connections forming in Hampton did not overlap with Greg's routines. Investigators noted that while Greg's life showed no external risks, Pamela's had links outside the marriage that could not be ignored. Evidence cross-checks now showed contrast. Preliminary. Witness reports of closeness between Pamela and Flynn. Working, late-night call records tied to student numbers. Negative, no financial irregularities, no evidence Greg himself engaged in risky behavior. The imbalance suggested that if this homicide had a personal origin, it would not be found in Greg's world, but in Pamela's. Interviews with Greg's family added weight. His relatives described him as trusting, unlikely to suspect betrayal. One relative told police, Greg would never have imagined something happening inside his own home. That trust aligned with the absence of defensive wounds at the crime scene. He likely knew the person who pulled the trigger or allowed them close without fear. For detectives, this created a pattern: a silent crime scene, a victim with no enemies, and a spouse whose words contradicted forensic reality. Then, threads leading into a high school environment and a teenage student who kept surfacing in testimony. The narrative was not complete, but the direction was clear. In towns like Derry, where violent crime was rare, each new finding resonated through the community. Rumors circulated quickly, amplified by media coverage, once whispers of a possible affair began to surface. Investigators, however, had to separate speculation from admissible fact. That meant focusing on corroboration, phone records, timelines, and consistent witness accounts. The weight of the case began to shift. The first 3 chapters of the investigation were dominated by silence, negative evidence, controlled scenes, and dead ends. Now, with school connections under scrutiny, the silence was breaking. Procedural momentum had turned toward motive, access, and a set of relationships that could explain why a young man with no known enemies was executed in his living room. As one detective later summarized, "It wasn't Greg's world that gave us answers. It was Pamela's." As detectives pieced together inconsistencies from Pamela Smart's statements and the sterile crime scene in Derry, their attention turned toward Hampton. That was where her professional life and social connections overlapped in ways Greg's world never had. What began as whispers from colleagues and students soon hardened into investigative leads. For the first time since May 1, 1990, the case had momentum. The victimology had made one fact clear. Greg Smart, by all accounts, was a trusting young man with no known enemies. His life revolved around his insurance job, his music, and his short marriage. The absence of defensive wounds at the scene suggested he allowed his killer close. That aligned with testimony from his family. Greg would never suspect someone in his inner circle of plotting against him. If the answer wasn't in his life, it had to come from Pamela's. Detectives re-interviewed students at Winnicott High. Patterns emerged. Pamela had spent unusual amounts of time with Billy Flynn, a 16-year-old sophomore. Teachers described his sudden access to Pamela's office. Students remembered seeing him near her car after school, and call records tied Pamela to phone numbers linked with Flynn and 2 of his close friends. The timeline of those calls, often late at night, lined up too neatly with hours when Greg was home, unaware. Working evidence began to shift categories. What started as rumors now had corroboration. Multiple independent witnesses confirmed Pamela's closeness to Flynn. Call logs confirmed repeated late-night contact. Financial checks ruled out burglary. The framework of a conspiracy began to form. Prosecutors instructed detectives to pressure the students directly. Flynn was interviewed in a controlled setting. At first, he denied involvement, offering rehearsed lines about friendship and mentorship. But when confronted with call records and statements from classmates, his story began to fracture. Within hours, the interview produced a partial admission. Flynn acknowledged a relationship with Pamela that went beyond professional boundaries. It was preliminary, not a full confession, but it opened the door. Flynn's close friends, Patrick Randall, Vance Latomy Jr., and Raymond Fowler, were next. Each was brought in separately. Fowler, considered the weakest link, broke under questioning. He admitted being present near the condominium on the night Greg was killed. His words confirmed what detectives had suspected. This was not a burglary gone wrong. It was an orchestrated act. The account Fowler gave was blunt. Pamela had allegedly complained about Greg, telling the teens her marriage was unbearable. She framed divorce as unacceptable because of financial and social consequences. Fowler described conversations where Pamela implied there was only one way out. Flynn, young and impressionable, agreed to act. The others joined to support him. This testimony elevated the investigation from suspicion to working conspiracy. To secure the case, detectives needed independent confirmation. They pursued surveillance and recorded conversations. With cooperation from one of the teens, police captured Pamela discussing details that matched Fowler's statement. These recordings, while carefully redacted for admissibility, became confirmed evidence tying her to planning Greg's death. Geography played a role again. Pamela's movements between Hampton and Derry created opportunity. She had daily access to the students, time to cultivate influence and privacy away from Greg. Investigators mapped the path: Hampton for school, Derry for home, and the fatal intersection of both worlds inside the condominium. At this stage, the charging theory crystallized. Greg's murder was not the work of an unknown intruder. It was a targeted execution carried out by Billy Flynn with the support of his friends under Pamela Smart's direction. Detectives had witness statements, corroborating phone records, and recorded conversations. The case moved from working theory to prosecutable crime. The contrast was striking. The investigation began with a clean crime scene that offered no answers. 4 weeks later, it stood on the brink of charges built on testimony, digital evidence, and controlled recordings. What had looked like silence now spoke with clarity. Greg Smart's death was the product of a calculated plan, For the community, the revelations were devastating. A respected media coordinator at a local high school, now implicated in recruiting students to kill her husband. It challenged assumptions about trust, authority, and influence. It also underscored how manipulation could exploit immaturity and loyalty, with deadly results. By late summer 1990, prosecutors prepared to bring the case forward. Flynn and the other teens faced potential adult charges. Pamela Smart, as the alleged architect, faced conspiracy to commit murder. Each interview, each recording, each call log reinforced the theory of a deliberate plot. The procedural focus had shifted decisively. The sterile living room in Derry no longer looked like an unexplained anomaly. It was the endpoint of a conspiracy that spanned classrooms, telephones, and private conversations. By the spring of 1991, the investigation in Derry had left the condominium behind and entered a courtroom. What began as a husband found dead from a single gunshot had turned into a televised murder trial, one of the first in the country to be broadcast in full. Cameras captured every moment as the prosecution laid out its case. This was not a burglary gone wrong, but a plot directed from inside the marriage itself. Jurors heard how, within days of the shooting, teenage friends of William, Billy Flynn, began to talk under police questioning. Flynn himself eventually admitted to pulling the trigger, but the state argued he had not acted alone. Prosecutors claimed Pamela Smart had manipulated the boy, drawing him into both a relationship and a deadly plan. The evidence played out in layers. The handgun that killed Gregory was traced back to Flynn. Investigators also introduced secretly recorded conversations between Pamela and one of the teens, recordings made after police wired the young witness. On those tapes, prosecutors said, her words suggested knowledge and control of what had happened. Added to that were the sworn testimonies of Flynn and three friends, each describing how the idea of eliminating Greg Smart had been encouraged, not resisted by Pamela. The defense countered that these teenagers, facing decades in prison, had every reason to exaggerate her role in order to reduce their own punishment. They argued Flynn was already spiraling, that his obsession with Pamela clouded his judgment, and that the recordings were ambiguous. But jurors had to weigh the absence of robbery, the lack of forced entry, and the fact that nothing valuable was taken. The scene itself pointed toward intent rather than chance. As the weeks passed, the case drew national attention. Reporters filled the benches, their headlines describing a story that mixed suburban life, forbidden relationships, and the ultimate betrayal. Pamela Smart, only 23 years old, sat at the defense table, expression carefully measured as witness after witness detailed a chain of events that prosecutors said ended with her husband's murder. In May 1991, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on charges of accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. The sentence, life without parole. Flynn and his accomplices, in exchange for their cooperation, received lighter terms but remained marked as teenagers whose lives had been permanently altered by a single decision. Gregory Smart's cause of death, a single gunshot wound to the head, was confirmed in court. What was once a quiet condominium crime scene had become a landmark trial in American legal history, raising questions that still echo today about influence, accountability, and how justice should treat young offenders when adults are involved. When the verdict came down in May 1991, the Smart case didn't fade quietly into the court archives. Instead, it became one of the most enduring crime sagas in American legal memory. Gregory Smart was gone, killed by a single gunshot to the head in his own condominium. Pamela Smart, at just 23 years old, was sentenced to life without parole. The teenagers who carried out the act, led by William Billy Flynn, received prison terms that offered the possibility of eventual release. That disparity would become the centerpiece of nearly every appeal and media discussion that followed. Within weeks, Pamela's defense team filed motions challenging the use of secretly recorded conversations, arguing that they were taken under circumstances that violated her rights. Courts upheld the tapes, ruling that the cooperating witness had acted legally under police supervision. In appellate hearings through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the same arguments resurfaced. Coercion of teenage witnesses, unreliable testimony in exchange for lighter sentences, and claims of media saturation that may have tainted the jury pool. Each time, the rulings came back the same. The conviction stood. Outside the courtroom, the geography of this crime expanded. National media outlets compared the Derry case to other high-profile spousal murder prosecutions, pointing to a pattern: domestic life intersecting with calculated violence. Documentaries, books, and television specials examined every transcript, every photograph of the condominium, and every word from the teenagers who testified. In towns across New England, residents said the case changed how they thought about suburban marriages, no longer symbols of safety, but potential sites of hidden danger. Over the years, Flynn and the others grew older behind prison walls. Their eventual parole hearings forced the public to revisit the crime. In 2015, Flynn, then in his 40s, appeared before a board and expressed remorse, saying his life had been defined by a single fatal act he could never undo. He was granted parole after nearly 25 years. Other accomplices were also released under supervision. Pamela, however, remained in prison. The courts consistently refused her petitions, noting that she had never accepted responsibility for directing the murder. The appeals process highlighted a forensic reality. While physical evidence placed Flynn at the scene, the legal weight against Pamela relied heavily on testimony and recordings. That difference fueled debate about whether justice had been balanced or if the state had leaned too heavily on impression and influence. But the absence of forced entry, the intact valuables, and the alignment of stories from multiple teenagers formed a consistent evidentiary chain that appellate judges were unwilling to disturb. Decades later, the story still surfaces. Law schools study it for lessons about cooperating witnesses. Journalists revisit it to examine the early role of cameras in courtrooms. True crime series bring it back to audiences who weren't alive when the verdict was read. And in New Hampshire, the condominium where Gregory was killed is remembered as the site of a crime that forced a small town into national headlines. From a human perspective, the aftermath left families divided. Gregory's relatives endured the ongoing appeals, with the weight of knowing their son's death was the starting point for all of it. Pamela's supporters pointed to what they viewed as inconsistencies, pushing for clemency that never came. For the public, the case turned into a long-running question. How much influence should testimony from young offenders carry, and what does justice mean when sentences diverge so sharply? By the mid-2010s and into the 2020s, every legal avenue Pamela pursued was closed. She remained incarcerated, her life sentence reaffirmed at each stage. The shooter had walked free, middle-aged now, while she stayed behind bars, still maintaining her version of events. It was a stark reminder of how the justice system can deliver finality to some, but never resolution to all. The Gregory Smart case remains a fixed point in American true crime history. It is not just about the night of May 1, 1990, but about what came after. The trials, the appeals, the parole boards, and the relentless debate about fairness and accountability. In March 1991, the trial of Pamela Smart opened to cameras and national attention. Prosecutors argued she had manipulated her 15-year-old lover, William Billy Flynn, and his friends into killing her husband, Gregory Smart, in their Derry, New Hampshire condo. Flynn admitted he pulled the trigger, and the teen's testimony, supported by wiretaps and circumstantial evidence, convinced the jury Pamela Smart was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and witness tampering. She was sentenced to life without parole. Flynn and his accomplices received lengthy terms, though some were later paroled after decades in custody. Gregory Smart's family sat through every hearing, keeping the focus on the victim whose life was cut short. The case became one of the first media trials in the United States. It highlighted the dangers of blurred boundaries between adults and minors, the risks of excessive publicity, and the enduring weight of betrayal inside a marriage. More than 30 years later, Pamela Smart remains in prison. Looking back on Gregory Smart's case, I can't help but remind myself and you that trust is fragile, and when broken, the damage can ripple for decades. Crime doesn't just take a life, it tears through families, friendships, and entire communities. As someone walking you through this story, I hope it leaves you not only aware of what happened, but also more mindful of the choices we make and the people we let close. What do you think this tragedy teaches us about loyalty and responsibility? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case we uncover together.